let's get back into the world of technology across the continent. A report by Google and the International Finance Corporation estimates that Africa's internet economy has a potential to add about 5.2% to the continent's GDP by 2025. That report essentially shows that driving this growth is a combination of increased access to much faster quality internet connectivity at a lower price as well. The report's analysis conducted by Accenture also argues that in 2020, the continent's internet GDP may contribute approximately $115 billion to Africa's overall GDP output of about $2.5 trillion. According to Partech Ventures Africa, venture capital funding for startups has also gone up year on year for the past 5 years, with $2.02 billion in equity funding raised in 2019. Let's dig into the details of that report. Wale Ayeni is the acting global head of Disruptive Technologies and Venture Capital Investments at IFC. He's joining us from Washington with more details on this study. Wale, good to have you on the program. So this report is arguing that tech use and productivity gains from tech could add at least $180 billion to GDP by 2025. Walk us through the assumptions that led to that forecast.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure here. Generally, the internet has contributed to GDP. Like in the Western world, there's about 9% of GDP is because of the internet. And kind of the background to the report was through our partners at Accenture. We analyzed historically what has been the historical contribution of the internet to African GDP. I think in 10 years ago, it was about 1.1%. By 2020, that grew up to 4.5%. So the analysis that Accenture just did was extrapolating all of the historical data and then attaching it to kind of the initial growth rate, things like social media, internet connectivity, the adoption of cell phones, and seeing what that could lead to for 5 years from now. So the work was done by economists from Accenture, and then kind of the result was that there's a potential for kind of the internet economy in Africa to grow up to 180 billion in the year 2025. And that's kind of a near-term opportunity. And what we're seeing on the ground when you look at just the rate of the financing from startups is that there's a lot of ways in which the internet can contribute to the economy, whether that's financial services, whether that's ed tech, whether that's e-commerce. So we're seeing a lot of activities there. So there's a lot of both academic data, but also on-the-ground data that kind of supports kind of the potential trajectory of the internet to contribute that amount to the African GDP.
Indeed. I'll get back to the counter-arguments in a moment. But one of the things that stood out for me in the report was this argument that was made very prominently that the internet economy on the continent is one of the largest overlooked investment opportunities in the last decade. But I'll just come back to the basic question. Why is it overlooked? As you pointed out, every single data point shows there's opportunity here. But where's the money? Why is it overlooked?
I mean, that's kind of why we wrote the report, to actually highlight the opportunity as well, because the part of the issue is kind of just the PR around Africa. So when you look at Africa, people don't see it as a destination for digital economy, for the internet. But on the contrary, when you flip the coin, is that when you look at venture capital, which I'm part of, is that venture capital is a business of investing in the future. The African continent is the youngest continent on the planet. 60% of everybody here is below the age of 25. So the rate of adoption of technology is actually highest, or growing very, very rapidly in Africa. But traditionally, Africa has not been looked at as a destination for investment. So I'll give you some stats there. Now, when you look at it as a percentage of GDP, the global venture capital pool every year is about $200 billion invested in the space. As you said, the Partech report just showed that although it has grown in the last 5 years, is only $2 billion has been invested in venture capital in Africa. That's like 1% of total venture capital kind of investments. But that doesn't jive with kind of what the opportunity set actually is. And if you do the analysis as venture capital as a percentage of GDP, the rate is the lowest in Africa. In the US, it's about 8%. In India, it's about 3%. In Africa, it's actually about less than 1% of investments. 1% of GDP goes into venture capital investments. And I think that the reason for that is historically, Africa has historically been looked upon not as a traditional destination for kind of digital investments, but I think that trajectory is changing just because of the youth, and then also because of the caliber of the new kind of founders that we're seeing on the ground. And I say that because that's the most important thing, because when you talk about the digital economy, it's really at the bottom of it is about entrepreneurship. Is that the new kind of digital entrepreneurs that we're seeing in Africa now? They're talented, they're skilled, they understand how the world works, they're trained globally, and they're coming back to Africa to build big and large businesses that are pan-African in nature. And I think that is actually the crux of the matter, is that historically investors have not seen those kind of entrepreneurs, but those entrepreneurs are starting to emerge in Africa.
Is part of the problem also perhaps that they tend to think of Africa as a sort of monolithic entity? Because one of the other things that comes out in your report is that there's a lot of nuance around, for example, to use the developers that you're talking about. There are about 700,000 of them, but they're concentrated in about just 5 countries: Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. And yet, if we just talk about Africa as this monolithic entity, we're missing that granular country focus.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think it's Africa. There's a lot of nuance in Africa. There are 54 countries. It's very fragmented. But the opportunity actually that I see in with technology is that, just as the internet, is that you can actually use the internet to aggregate all that market and present it as a one Pan-African opportunity per se. There's a lot of nuance, country by country, destination, age groups, kind of the opportunity set. But holistically, the internet helps to aggregate kind of the entire African market to present it as a one large opportunity subset. It's not dissimilar to what we see in India, where there's a lot of fragmentation in India, but India is still one continent, right? And I think in Africa, the internet provides that opportunity where we can start to aggregate a lot of the smaller markets, put them in one kind of opportunity zone, and drive investments and services to populations that actually live there.
One last question for you, Wale. One of the underlying assumptions behind the growth forecasts lies in growth continuing pretty much as it has in the last decade. But if you look at the policy sets that are coming up on the ground, we're seeing more and more countries either trying to limit internet traffic or they're trying to levy taxes that retard growth. Given that sort of environment, aren't these forecasts a bit too optimistic?
No, like I hear you on kind of the taxation, and we won't worry about it because you don't want to tax things that are just nascent. Before we get into taxation and over regulation, we need to allow innovation to grow first of all. So I agree with you around kind of in countries where we see unnecessary taxation for early stage startups. We don't think that's the right thing, and that could challenge some of the forecast. But overall, no matter what governments do, I think it's too late to put the internet back in a box. The genie is out of the box. It's scaling. When you look at things like just the number of smartphones, the number of feature phones, the number of Africans that are accessing data every day, the bandwidth of data consumption in Africa is actually growing. So I think no matter what governments do, it's I think we've passed the notion where you can lock the internet out. I think most governments understand that the internet, there's pros and cons, but there's more pros than there are cons, right? There are issues around taxation, which we hope that the governments find a balance between proper taxation and allowing innovation to scale. But on the balance, we just feel like just the adoption and the youth engagement with the internet, it's definitely growing. And I don't think there's anything that people can do to put that back in a box.
Indeed. Wale Ayeni from the IFC, thank you very much.